Well, first of all, thanks to everyone who came out today on this nice day. Instead, you were inside with us, caring about books, so you are my friends. Thanks to the National Bookstore, to the festival for inviting me, and thank you for joining me. We had a conversation the other day, and we had such a nice talk about books and literature, and I thought, this guy, he is so smart. I really like this guy. And then he leaned over and he said, I'm going to be the one talking to you on stage on Saturday. And I just wanted to give him a big hug. So thank you.
Thanks, Adam. So let's talk about your dad.
Yes.
He had an unusual occupation, and he used to do something. You used to do something unusual with him after dark.
That's right. My father was the nighttime security guard at the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona, and he would go to work at night, and he would keep the zoo safe, and he had many duties. And when I was a little kid, he would take me to work with him because my mother was working on her doctoral degree, and this was our babysitting. And so she would do her academic studies for a couple hours and then come get me. But my father, he's a wonderful guy. He's with me in Manila. He's in a tour of intramurals right now. So maybe he knows I'm telling the story. But we would go to the zoo, and first of all, we would kind of rob the zoo. We would go to the big cat meat locker and get steaks. He would bring a cooler with him. And there was all kinds of great fruits and vegetables because we did not have much money. My mother was a graduate student, and my dad was a security guard. So we would go and get fresh fruits and vegetables for the animals, and then we would take them out to the car. And then we would go around the zoo. And one thing I think I learned as a kid is that there was a zoo that everyone saw, where the animals were on a certain kind of display. But at night, they would be sent down to their real enclosures, where you could get close to them. And this was the real zoo. This was the truer, purer zoo. And we would go down and we would talk to Hazel, who was the lowland gorilla. We would go talk to all the animals and spend time getting to know them. And I think as a kid, I learned that there's the world everyone sees, and then the job of all of us in life is to penetrate that, to see what the real thing is. And as a writer, I've always tried to lift that veil for the reader.
That's an amazing story. Let's talk about the fact that your bachelor's degree is in journalism.
That's right.
But then you made the jump from journalism to fiction. Mm-hmm. And I hear it involves a certain teacher of yours.
That's right.
Let's talk about that. How did you move from your journalism degree to becoming a fictionist?
I did love being a journalist as a young writer. I loved to go out and interview people and research. There was no Google in 1990. You had to get out. And you had to talk to people and track down documents, and it was investigative, and I loved engaging the world in that way. But I would go to cover silly things, a city council meeting, or someone who came to campus to speak, and I would feel that I had a sense of what really happened when the mayor spoke. But I didn't exactly have the quotes to show what I felt, so sometimes I would make them up. And then I would write my stories, and my professor, Mr. Halverson, he could always tell. He always knew. He said, this detail, you made it up, didn't you? And I'd be like, of course I did. And he said, you can't make up quotes. He says, you have to put down what you discover and let the reader decide what the truth is. And I said, no, my duty is to find the truth and give it to the reader. And he said, creative writing is in that building.
All right, so The Orphan Master's Son, if you haven't read it yet, it's available outside. It's a great, great read. I could not put it down. It is, however, set in North Korea, a country that I was never interested in until I read your book. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about how you got interested in North Korea, because it happened just out of the blue, right? You just became interested. How did you wind up writing a novel about North Korea?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you. I teach a class on novel writing to undergraduates at Stanford, and we'll often just read a whole bunch of books and see what we can steal, what great techniques and craft and maneuvers and effects various writers have done. But I always throw in one memoir in that class. So as we fake the false lives of imagined people, we can see how a real person writes his or her own memoir. And that year I picked a Korean writer named Kang Chol-hwan, and he wrote a memoir about growing up in a gulag in North Korea. It's called The Aquariums of Pyongyang. It's a very powerful book. And we all read it together. And when we met at class together at Stanford, we couldn't talk about the technique or the craft or how the story was told. We all had to just share what we'd encountered, that this was possible, this experience on the planet Earth. In North Korea, the way terror is spread from the state to the individual is through the family. And so they have family gulags there. He grew up in Yodok, which has 55,000 prisoners in it. Right now, they're in it, you know? They're going to bed right now after a hard day's work. And Camp 1418, which straddles the Taedong River, also has another 50,000 people in it. So those are the two biggest camps. When Chang was 8, someone in his family ran afoul of the state. He never really understood because he was a kid, and his whole family was shipped off to the prison. And they spent 10 years there. In the prisons in North Korea, every February 16th, which is the birthday of Kim Jong-il, yes, there was every February 16th was movie day, and no one would work and they would all watch movies. But April 15th was the birthday of the great leader Kim Il-sung. And as a gift, he would commute the sentence of one family from every gulag. They're called Kwanli-so camps. And his family members got enough money to bribe the system so that they could be allowed to get out. So he got out of a North Korean gulag, then out of North Korea, then out of southern China, which is the triple crown of survival. So his story was one of the rarest on earth. And so I read this book and I realized I did not know this was happening in the world today. I also saw my general ignorance. I did not know that much about Korean history, even though I had many Korean students and Korean American colleagues. And I did not know that much about the Korean War. In America, they made a TV show called MASH. It's a comedy. Mostly they drank martinis. And that's what I knew about the war. So I spent a whole year just researching Korea and North Korea especially. And I just became more and more obsessed about how do you be a human there? What's it like to grow up there? How do you find love in North Korea? What do you have for breakfast? You know, where do you get your clothes? And I hunted for these portraits and I tried to read all these books. But what I discovered is that they weren't in books, they were online.
So you also went out of your way to talk to some defectors from North Korea. Talk about there's in the Orphan Master's book, Orphan Master's Son, there's a scene where the family wakes up and there are loudspeakers inside their houses.
That's right.
And that's how they start the day. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. Well, at first I read the stories of North Koreans online, as you can. There were lots of aid workers and Christian missionaries who were encountering defectors and putting their stories online. It took me a long time before I met my first North Korean. You know, in 1972, Kim Il-sung wired the nation of North Korea with what is basically cable radio, and he put loudspeakers in everyone's houses and in everyone's workplaces and in public spaces. The excuse was it was an air raid system should the Americans bomb them again, and this is the way that they controlled the population. He did it through cable or wires because he was afraid that the Americans could, or the South Koreans could jam the signal otherwise. So the family wakes up to the daily propaganda as for generations people have in North Korea.
And I understand that you've never seen photos of these, but that you heard it in every story. Is that right?
Well, this is the difficulty of writing about North Korea for journalists, is that all you have are satellite photos and the stories of people who escape, who are a self-selecting group, and how representative are they? You know, it's difficult to know. If North Korea looks like this, and here's the DMZ, and Pyongyang's here, and Chongjin's here, 2/3 of all the people who escaped from North Korea come from this one province called North Hamgyong, right? And here is the farthest you can get from the capital. So there's the least amount of food, and there's a couple prison camps there, and life is the hardest. So when we hear stories from North Korea, they're from people who've had it the roughest of anyone. So trying to figure out what normal lives are like was a big challenge. And I got a little far from the question, Well.
No, that's fine. Of course, you are one of the few people who have ever been to North Korea. Certainly in this room, I assume you're probably the only one.
Who has been to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? Anyone?
So he is the only one in the room who's been to the DPRK. So let's talk about your trip.
Yes.
Why did you decide? When did you go? And what happened?
That's right. Well, I realized if I was really going to depict this place, if I was going to represent it in scene, I had to see it for myself. And it was very difficult to get there. I applied to be a visiting professor, a visiting scholar at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, and that didn't work. I thought, try to give them something. So I invited a professor from POST, which is the Pyongyang Polytechnical Institute, to come to Stanford for a year. But that didn't work. Eventually I met a man, he was another professor in America, and he was of Korean descent, and he had a good relationship with the North because he had an NGO with some other people that planted apple orchards. And he'd planted 14,000 apple trees in North Korea to help mitigate hunger. And he'd also founded orphanages in North and South Korea. So he had a good relationship. And so he heard about my book. He said, no one in the world's writing a book like you. He said, I will take you there. And so he risked all of his reputation, all of his relationships to take me there. But he'd been to Pyongyang 14 times over a couple decades. So when we went, he could say, the last time I was in this plaza, there was a military display. The last time I was here, there were loudspeakers playing. And when we went to the Grand People's Study House, which is the main library in Pyongyang, we walked up to a room, and a Meng Kyun Ha, my friend, he said to me, there's a man sitting in there, and he is a Juche scholar, and we're going to open the door, and he's been sitting there for 30 years waiting to answer questions about Juche. And he opened the door, and there he was. And the guy remembered Dr. Ha and got up and hugged him. And it was deeply scary. Also, we went to check out a book from the Pyongyang library, and he knew exactly which book they were going to give you. When I talked to them, I asked them how many books they had in the library, and they said 13 million volumes. And I said, wow, at Stanford we only have 7 million books. And they were like, yeah, too bad. And so they said, would you like a book? We have all the books in the world here. And she said, I know the book to give you. And they had an automated conveyor belt system with a little mechanical train that went through the library and delivered books. And so she said, I know just the book for you. And she went back and got a book and put it on the train, and the train brought it to us. And as it was coming, Dr. Ha whispered what book it would be in my ear. And it was a book they had selected to project a sense that they were advanced and cosmopolitan and urbane. You want to guess what book it was? It was the operating manual for Windows 95.
But my understanding is you actually had to play dumb when you went to North Korea. Tell us why that was. You knew so many things about North Korea, but when you got there, you couldn't tell them what you knew.
Yes. Well, it's true that I had researched North Korea for a few years before I went. And, my worst fear was that in going, I would endanger other people. And the minders whose job it was to promulgate the greatness of North Korea, they're people with families. And their jobs depended on sharing these ideas. And when we went to museums, because we were Americans, they were very nervous. And so the museum docents would come out, and their bosses would watch them, and their performance, was evaluated on this. So I was nervous. And because we were Americans. The director of the KITC, the minder of the minders, kept dropping in to mind them, which made them very, very nervous. And so I once, when we went to the Revolutionary Martyr Cemetery, which they were glad that I wanted to see this national historic place, I realized that since I'd researched it, some of the headstones had been switched. And I said, well, didn't so-and-so used to be buried in this grave? And there was a new big plaque that involved Kim Jong-il's mother. And I said, when did she become a martyr? And they all stopped and stared at me. And they took a walk, and they talked to one another, and I could see them gesture together, and they came back and they said, we have to go. And I learned to, these were very smart, wonderful people, but I learned to be very careful.
Let's talk about the drainage cover.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to talk about that briefly to show them how much you were essentially forcefully chaperoned.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, you're told when you go to North Korea and when you're going to leave. You've got to remember, this is a place without any free enterprise. There's not a single coffee shop or restaurant. Every single human works for the state, right? And when you're a foreigner, they put you in a hotel called the Yanggak on Yanggakdo, which is an island in the Taedong. And citizens of Pyongyang cannot get onto the island without a pass, and guests cannot leave the island without a minder. And everyone who worked in the hotel were Chinese workers on contract. That's how scared they were that you would actually meet a North Korean and, maybe talk to them. If I could have just spoken to one person in Pyongyang and had a cup of tea, maybe so many of my questions would have been answered that easily, So as we went around Pyongyang, I would ask questions. Where are all the fire stations? It was a big city of 3 million people. And I said, where are all the mailboxes? I said, where are the mailboxes? She said, we have the best mail system in the world. I said, yeah, but if I want to mail a letter to someone, where do I put it? She says, in the perfect mail system of the world. And again, I said, there's no fire stations that I can see. You know what she said? She said, we haven't had a fire in 12 years. We don't need them. We don't need them, So I do remember a question I asked her. It was a question I asked by mistake. And I noticed that, of course, there are only a couple haircuts on men, and there are only 6 different kinds of shoes. And you've got to remember, people's clothes don't look different because they don't have commercial makers. Their clothes are all made by the state. And so people look eerily similar. And I noticed as we were walking around Pyongyang that all the women were wearing the exact same kind of lipstick. And you don't know how spooky that is to see thousands of people with a mark on them that made them look identical. And then I noticed that my own minder, she was a wonderful lady, very smart, very intelligent, very funny, was wearing that lipstick. And I said, everyone's wearing the same lipstick. What's the name of the color? I really wanted that in my book. And she gave me a look of like shame and anger. She didn't like wearing that shade of lipstick at all, and I had observed that. And I felt that hurt in her right then. And I remember kind of the last straw. The kind of the last straw was, we went to the big square near the Cholima statue where Kim Il-sung's gigantic statue is, if you know it. Now, Kim Jong-il's statue is there as well, of course. It's the most sacred place. It's like going to the Vatican. It's the most honored place in all of North Korea. I had to bring a suit with me for this particular occasion. Everyone had to have a tie. Every single citizen had to buy a wreath of flowers to even approach the place. But as we were crossing this big plaza, I noticed there was a sewer cap. And it had the horse of Cholima leaping 100 ri, and this beautiful Hangul writing on it. And it had flowers and characters, and I'd never seen a sewer cap as beautiful in my life. What people would make such a gorgeous sewer cap? And I stopped her, and I said, will you translate this beautiful sewer lid for me? And she looked at me murderously, like we were in the most holy place on earth. And I was looking at the sewer cap, And she looked at me like, I will never figure out who you are.
He was brought in on a lot of buses during that time. Yeah. So let's talk about The Orphan Master's Son. You won the Pulitzer for it. Where were you when you found out you had won, and what did that feel like?
Well, I was using a Google Doc with an editor in New York, and we were writing a nonfiction piece for a magazine, and we were on the phone and on Google Docs, like live editing both of it together for a deadline. And my phone just kept beeping and beeping with texts and texts and texts. And I tried to ignore it for a while, but my wife was sick. She was going through chemotherapy right then, and she wasn't at home, so I was worried. And I said to this editor, I said, I've got to check this because I'm worried about my wife and that there's something wrong with her. And I answered a call. There were all these calls. I answered the call, and someone, I don't know who it was, I don't know if I ever found out, said, "Dude, you won the Pulitzer Prize." And I just hung up on that person. And I was like, so I called the editor back, and he said, "Is your wife okay?" And I said, "Yeah, some guy said I won the Pulitzer Prize." And he said, "Congratulations." And I said, "Don't say shit like that." He was like, "Why?" I said, "I don't know. That's wrong." And there was a weird silence, and he said, "Can I Google it?" I thought about it. I said, "Okay." And he said, "I think you won the Pulitzer Prize." So it was I don't know what I think of it, but I do, or what prizes do to artists, but I do care about the topic of North Korea and about the fates of the people in North Korea, and if it brings the topic to more people, that's something I do feel good about. And I do think that it helps spur a lot of other good books about North Korea to be able to come to the market. So now there's many books that an interested reader can turn to.
You guys have to check that out, because the world that he talks about of North Korea in The Orphan Master's Son, I'd never imagined that it could be real, and apparently it is. Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. We talked a little about this before. Do you write every day? What is your writing process like?
Well, I'm sure there's many writers in the room, and everyone has to discover their own way. I have 3 kids, and I teach, and so I feel like I'm always either being a bad dad or a bad writer or a bad teacher. I don't know what the answer is. I have a little office in my house, but it's underneath the room where my kids hang out. And when I write, there's this question that comes, like, I'm down here spending my day with imaginary people, and real people who need me are above me. And why? Why are you doing this? And I don't have an answer to that, except to leave the house, and then I don't ask the question. So I write, there's a hospital near me in San Francisco, and I walk to a medical library that's filled with books with horrible pictures of diseases and eyeballs, and I write there. And I don't have access to the internet there, so that's where I write.
Let's talk about what you're working on now. You're working on a new book right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I am. I'm working on a new book, and I'm kind of, in the middle of it.
Okay. Can you tell us anything about it?
I thought I just did.
All right. You have 3 kids.
That's right.
Just as an interesting thing, Adam's too busy to do it, but the rest of your family, they do jiu-jitsu.
That's right.
And I understand, but you do go and you practice archery together.
Right.
Is that right? Is that true?
Yes. Is archery big in the Philippines?
Not so much. It's unusual for us.
Oh, come to the range with me. Come shooting with me, and you'll buy your own bow, I think. Yeah, my kids and my wife love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They've been doing it for many years. When I was, before I'd married my wife and we were dating, she would go to the gym, and I didn't really know what she was doing. I thought she was working out, but she would come home in her gi, dobron, and I remember one day she came home, she was all sweaty. She's like, I learned a new move. And I was like, what was it? And she leaped up into the air. I'm big and she's small. She leaped up into the air and her arms flew around me and she put her legs around me that locked in a weird way. And I thought, that's so strange. And then this arm was around my neck and this other arm did this. And then this like third hand appeared and it like pushed my head forward. I was like, I tried to say, hey, this is weird, but I couldn't talk. And then, you know, strangulation cuts off your breathing, but a choke squeezes your blood vessels. So you don't really know that you're going unconscious. And things went a little sparkly, and then there was a tunnel, and we both fell down together, and I knew this was my girl.
You've been teaching in Stanford for a long time. Can you share with us, I know you love to teach.
Yes.
So what do you enjoy most about it? And you teach creative writing, so specifically about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I teach undergraduates, and we have a fellowship program there called the Stegner Fellowship, which are writers of all ages from all around the world, and some older than me. And I love the undergraduates the most. I feel like when they come to me, especially the freshmen, I beg to teach the freshmen. They want me to teach big lecture classes for some reason, but I like to teach intimate classes of young people because they're so eager and they're so amazed. And whenever you mention a book, they come back next week and they've read it. You know, and they're at this time when I can convert them into ruining their lives by becoming writers. And I've had many great students from the Philippines. And when I posted on Facebook, everyone's like, oh, you have to go to Chupacabra. Oh, you have to go to Cahegador Island, you know, all these things. And, you know, just last quarter, I had a student from Quezon City. And he wrote a story in class, and it's the kind of story I want all, you know, writers to write. And I have students who are like, I'm from Hong Kong, from a giant tower, and there's hundreds of towers, and my life is like everyone else's, and it's not special or worth writing about, you know? Or, oh, I'm from a suburb in Atlanta, and my life is lame. And, you know, he came to my class, and he was like, oh, you know, I'm from Quezon City, and no one wants to hear my story because I'm from an elite family, you know? And my story's not important. It's the people who are poor in Manila who, you know, need their stories told. And I was like, no, I want to hear your story. And he wrote this story about being very troubled about being in the elite class and getting the benefits of being at a good school and of having a driver and of having friends who were not questioning this life, who were just thrilled about having privilege and going out and spending money and having fancy meals. And he was really troubled about it and how he did something in life one time that challenged them and threw all their relationships into turmoil. And it was just the best story I received, you know, all year, because he'd really looked inward and he'd contemplated what mattered.
Well, we can jump off from that point. What have you been doing ever since you got to Manila, and what has it been like for you? Well, did you get that barong made? He wanted, the first thing we talked about was he wanted to get a barong Tagalog made. When he got, did you get one made?
Okay. Well, I've been in Matake mostly. I've been doing a lot of walking because I attempted to drive somewhere. Yeah, I attempted to drive somewhere. It took me 35 minutes, you know, and when I was not going to get in another car in, you know, in the Philippines again. And when I walked home, it took me only 20 minutes to walk back. So, you know, on one hand, I've been a little trapped in this area because just how far I can walk. But I do like walking around and seeing the people and, you know, doing things like that. It was a real treat to go to Cahegador yesterday and to see all that history out there. And, you know, it's one thing to know about Bataan, and it's to have heard of Cahegador and to go there and to feel the lives and to feel the history and to imagine. But the gun emplacements are real. The history's real. And to look out on the water and imagine all those soldiers who were the last line of defense for this entire nation, and knowing that the Japanese were coming. I tried to imagine, you know, I came up short as a human when I imagined what they must have thought. So that was very powerful. And I'm here today because I love to be with readers and writers. My family's off in Intramuros today, and we're going to go to El Nido tomorrow.
Excellent.
Yeah, really. I've never been to Paradise before. So.
Did you get the barong made?
Okay.
I need to know the story. I'm obsessed with it.
Okay, I am going to have a barong made. Don't worry, we will go do it together. Okay, we will get matching ones. How about that? Okay, on me. I was going to get one at one place, and someone said, "Oh no, you must go to." I won't even say their names. So we'll say, "Oh no, only a fool. You must go here and ask for so and so." I was like, "Okay," and I made the mistake of mentioning it. That someone said, "Oh no. You must go here."
When I met him, he was wearing a Guayabara shirt.
Yes.
And then, so I understood that he was really sincere about his interest in that kind of clothing.
Right.
So I'm hoping that turns out well for you. At this point, we would like to turn it over to the audience. Does anybody want to ask a question of the most interesting man on earth? Does anyone? Yes, in the back, please.
Hello, Evan. I've read your short story collection, Emporium, and
Yes,
I quite liked it. My question is, America, as a country, it has probably the most antagonistic relationship with North Korea. How does your identity as an American writer affected your process in writing The Orphan Master's Son? And also, just
Yeah.
I'll be that guy and ask this a second question.
Sure, of course.
Did your writing of the book, did it ever get a response from the North Korean government?
Okay, all right, okay. Remind me of the second part because I might forget that. This is a great question. North Korea, in their own mythology, and after I kind of got into the stories of defectors, I really became obsessed with North Korean propaganda, which is the story they tell about themselves. And propaganda is fascinating and quite strange. You need a lot of coffee to drink it because it's a little mind-numbing to read it. But in their mythology, because of the Korean War, and I will say that the bombing that America did in Korea was ruthless and unprecedented and has not been fully gazed upon in any way. America had an Air Force ready to deal with an Asian theater and an entire European theater that was unleashed on a very small peninsula. And it was Pyongyang was bombed the way Manila was bombed, so that only a couple buildings remain. And you know how that can live on through generations. And so the fear and hatred of America is very real from people who were just victims of bombing. Now, that has been co-opted by the regime to create a David and Goliath story, right? And so this small country, 23 million people, has decided that the great enemy is around the world, right? Now, they have a triad of enemies, which is South Korea, the ROK, and Japan, of course. So, but woven into everything is this loathing of America, I will say that the North Koreans don't get much influence, depending on where you live. It's not a monolithic place, about the external world. They almost exclusively get internal portraits. And so I think this leads to a problem in the world, which is that people can depict North Korea in lots of ways that North Koreans are never aware of, right? So no one would ever make a joke about Syria, right? No one would ever make a joke about the Rwandan genocide. But people can joke about North Korea because North Koreans are never going to hear it. And they're probably not going to meet a North Korean in their life to answer for it. And so my experience in writing the book was that I found portraits of North Korea like Team America, or you've seen The Interview, perhaps, or heard of it, in which the place was depicted as a place of insanity, clownishness, evil, or buffoonery. And really it's just a place where, unfortunately, 23 million people have been born into the strangest and cruelest psychological experiment ever devised by humans. So I don't know. How did being an American affect me? Maybe there's two more aspects to that. First of all, what was it like to write about being a non-Korean? And like I found myself obsessed with this place and just what was it like to be a person there. And I found a hard time finding human portraits. Like what was it like to just be a person there? And those were really rare. And so when I finally started writing, I kept asking myself, like, who am I? Like, I'm a white dude in California, right? And I don't speak Korean. Like, what am I doing trying to make this missing portrait, Also, like, I've never been through a famine. I've never been tortured. Like, these experiences are very far from me. And all I had was research and imagination. And this question of, like, who am I, like, has never gone away. And I've never answered it, really. It's still there. But as I researched North Korea, I'll just say, another question came to reside next to it. And as I studied North Korea, I realized that it is the most voiceless place on earth. And they don't have storytelling. They don't have their own narrative other than the state-sponsored one. They don't even have access to their own literature. When the Japanese invade in 1910 and start the colonial period of the peninsula, which lasts 35 years, they make the Korean theater illegal, Korean music illegal. The Gyeogyum and the Taegum, national instruments, become off limits. They import, Japanese teachers, and everyone has to take on Japanese names. And so literature disappears. And then there's World War II, division by the superpowers, the Korean War, and in the North, a dictatorship for over 6 decades. So no one in North Korea, and I know you people care about books, no one there has read a book as you know it in 100 years. They don't have a living relative who has read a book that would question society or be about the individual, right? So they don't have that tradition. It's been stolen from them. And I also believe that defectors have a hard time telling their stories. There's a lot of defectors, but they've been trained their whole lives not to reveal their true thoughts. They're often traumatized by their escapes. They have survivor's guilt for making it out. And they want to look forward generally rather than backward. So, who am I? I don't know. Maybe like when North Koreans are allowed to tell their own stories, like that's the point at which we'll really know. And they may say, "Oh, that white dude got it all wrong," and I'm okay with that.
Before we answer his second question, I just want to ask this one. We talked the other day about this. The other journalist asked, you talked about defecting, and you had a wonderful description of what it's like to defect from the north to the south.
Yeah.
Can you share that with us so we can understand a little bit of what it feels like to have to defect?
Well, you think, oh, you're in a terrible place, and all you have to do is get out, right? But it's much more difficult than that. If you manage to make it to the Yalu or Tumen rivers and you manage to cross, sometimes of the year it's easier to defect than others. Sometimes it's very dangerous. But China has a repatriation agreement with North Korea. And so if you're caught and the officials become aware of you, you get sent back. And so depending on your history and who you are, it's going to be a big problem or a really big problem, right? And so it's because of that people can use that vulnerable status against defectors. Slave labor, sex trafficking, farmers' wives. Like you escape North Korea and you get stuck becoming a farmer's wife, And because they have no recognition in China and anyone can send them back to their peril, people are extra vulnerable. And to actually reach freedom, if you have enough money, you can probably get your answers solved by a coyote right away. If you defect with a lot of money, which means you're probably an elite, you can get a fake passport and a ticket to Seoul right away. But most people have to go 2 places before they'll get sent to South Korea. It's to Mongolia, if If you can visualize that, it's quite a walk. Or to Southeast Asia. You have to get to Thailand across the Mekong. And that is 1,500 miles. And then once you get there, of course, you become, held as an immigrant, and you've got to be processed, and people can spend 6 months in what feels like a jail. And then when they finally make it to South Korea, and the journey is, average journey is 1.5 years from defection to making it to South Korea, then you're put in a facility called Hanawon, where most people, depending on how aware they are, spend 2 to 3 months to help them adjust to life in South Korea. Actually, there's 23 different facilities in Hanawon. And they invented Hanawon because people were having such a hard time adjusting. Even though it takes them a while to adjust to the outside world, they still came from a place that doesn't have a stoplight or a phone book, where you don't pay rent, where you get your food with ration cards. Imagine going to Seoul, one of the more sophisticated cities in the world, and how difficult that is. And of course, you could be identified by your accent as a North Korean. And not everyone makes it easy for you.
We had that conversation about if you could go to New York, remember that?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that in terms of defection? You asked, what if you could go to one place, but, for example.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And, people say, well, why don't people defect? Almost 30,000 people have defected from North Korea since the 50s. Under, Kim Jong-il, over 2,000 were defecting a year. Kim Jong-un has tightened that down a lot. And so the last couple of years have only seen about 1,100, about half. So it's more dangerous, and obviously more people are trying and failing, and we don't know what's happening to them. But, as I said to Ruel the other day, defecting, even if you defect and your outcome is good, let's say someone said, hey, do you want to go to New York? And you were like, yeah, okay, I'll go to New York. That's a great place. Just whatever city, Tokyo, whatever city you dreamed of going to, But what if they said you could never go back? In fact, you could never talk to anyone from home. In fact, you would never have any contact from home. You would never have any news from home. And every association you ever had with your home would lead to nothing from there afterwards. And so it's not easy to defect, to leave every single thing you know. And I think on the range of human experience, to be, born in North Korea is pretty far out there. But what's fascinating is it's an interesting place to look back more toward the middle, where many of our lives exist. And think about prisoners in jail, and I'll talk about America. The recidivism rate is really high. And if you asked any prisoner, do you want to be out, they would all say yes unanimously. And yet, why do so many of them end up back there? It's a place that's normal, that they become high functioning, that they understand the rules, right? It feels safe. It's risky to go into the unknown, And so, I wonder how many of us take such risks in life.
Did you ever get any North Korean response to your book?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll say this is just me speaking, and I've never claimed to be an expert. I don't know anything about North Korea that you wouldn't know if you didn't kind of obsessively study the place for 7 years, right? And I just talked to people and Googled and read books. So I'm not an expert on things, and I'm not an expert on South Korea either. But from my experience, South Korea is the least interested country in the world in North Korea. And so, I kind of wonder, you know what the most North Korea obsessed country in the world is? Japan. Immediately you knew it. All the books I wanted to read, I had to get translated from Japanese. They were obsessed with it. Of course, the North Koreans come and kidnap their citizens and have for decades. But their history is darkly intermingled in a lot of ways. But in South Korea, the older generation, these wounds are real, the family separations are real, they care very deeply. But the young people, the guns have been pointed at them for 30 years. and they're used to it. They grew up with it. They just want to find great jobs and find love and get the awesome phones and do whatever young people want everywhere. And so my book was published in South Korea as an oddity. Like a strange American wrote a book about our neighbor. It was published by the Asan Policy Institute, which is a very fine, think tank. But they ran a small number of copies just to say, we'll put this in our library. So I don't think average people, found the book in their bookstores. But I have met a couple defectors who have read the book. The first one I met was a man named Jan Jin Sung, and I went to interview him to research another piece I was writing, and then I found out before I met him that he had read my book. And I was so nervous to meet him. I was like, what if he says, oh, dude, you got it so wrong? I was so scared. Even though I'd done all that research, I was honestly terrified to meet him, because one word for him would have meant a lot to me. But the opposite came. Actually, when I met him, he threw this large hug on me, and he was just weeping on my shoulder. And when someone cries in front of me, I cry. And the two of us just sat there kind of crying together. And he, I don't know. It's not a big survey. It's not statistically significant, but I don't know. Aspects of it spoke to the two people I met. But you've got to think about this. North Korea and the 15 provinces, Pyongyang's down here. If you're born in Pyongyang, you have a certain kind of life. You were an elite, right? You have a cell phone, you have an iPad, you go to movies, you have real education instead of indoctrination. You might have a job that matters in the bureaucracy. You could actually advance through the bureaucracy. And here's like Mount Baekdu, the Yalun Tumen. If you're born on a border province, like either you've crossed or you know people who cross back and forth to do a little bit of capitalism, your cell phone can jump onto a Chinese tower. People are smuggling in South Korean, soap operas on DVD or VCD. You're pretty aware of things. It's the landlocked provinces that are like a mystery to us, where people rarely defect from. And I kind of got going, I forgot the question.
It's fine.
Yeah.
I haven't heard the word VCD in a while. Neither have you. Okay, other questions for Adam?
I'll answer this one much more briefly. I apologize for that long answer.
In front, please.
Yeah, sure. I can repeat it.
It's my understanding that you didn't actually go to North Korea until midway into writing the book. Which means that all the characters feel so lived in. It's pretty amazing that you didn't go to. You. Oh no, I mean I don't think that's. I think that's indisputable. So anyway, so what drove the decision for the timing to go to the place midway into the book? Because if it was me, I would not have the conviction and my own abilities or my own imagination to write before going to the place that I'm writing about.
Right. Well, that's a good question. When Kim Jong-il was still alive, and people said, "Should I go to North Korea?" I said, well, you've got to grapple with the morality of your money going to the regime, and they're going to use it for rocket parts and champagne. And because I was trying to get a portrait for my book, that was okay with me, because Kim Jong-il did not hurt tourists. Actually, he was very savvy and very smart, and what he wanted was hard currency. The won has no value internationally, so they can buy nothing without RMB or euros or yen or dollars or whatever. And so they have it's a giant kleptocracy designed to get money in so they can buy the things they want. And one of the things is tourism. And so Kim Jong-il, when he needed money, he would let tourists in. And when he didn't, he would close it off. And that's how it works under a dictatorship, right? There's no consistency or rule of law. And the year before I went, there were no Americans. And they told me, no Americans came last year. And then you came this year because my friend, had connections. He knew Kim Yong-gil, who was the DPRK ambassador to the UN. So once I became deeply obsessed with North Korea, and you didn't want to know me then, I was like the dude at the party who was like, oh, let me tell you this interesting fact about Kim Jong-il, and you'd be like, and then I would tell you 20 more, and you would like move to the door. But Kim Jong-il was a really stable, predictable figure, and he was about money and power. And what makes Kim Jong-un tick, nobody's sure of yet. And the couple people who have been close to him, and I interviewed his nanny, Kenji Fujimoto, 6 times in Japan. Nobody's sure what makes him tick. And so when he closes the Kaesong Industrial Complex and loses $1 million a day for over 100 days, that doesn't make any sense. And when he throws tourists in jail, that means that when he wants money, he cannot invite tourists. And so I don't recommend people to go there now because I think he's a loose cannon, or he appears that way from our limited knowledge of him, you know. So, I became deeply obsessed, and I was like, I have to get to this place immediately. And weirdly, I'd never even been to Korea. And the one place you cannot get to North Korea from is South Korea. The last plane that tried to fly from South Korea to North Korea, you remember, was shot down. So, like, I'd never even been to South Korea, and it was like my sole obsession, and it took me like 2.5 years. So it was as fast as I could do it.
All right, one more question. We have time for one more question. Over in the back, the gentleman there.
Hello, test. Okay. This is kind of a bit weird question, but I've watched the film called The Interview, and it's featuring the North Korean guy Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-il. Then I heard stories that the North Koreans have reacted against it. So now that this has become popular worldwide, will this somehow like affect his decision on like warfare or whatsoever?
Okay, yeah. Let me see if I can, share my thoughts on that movie. If you've seen it, it's not just about North Korea. It's about farts and butts and poop and sex, and it's a kind of ridiculous American, comedy. And again, no one would make that, comedy about France, right? Maybe it wouldn't be France isn't as funny to some people, but France would be up in arms. And I think people think it's a free pass. I mean, think about like the enemies in movies. It used to be like whenever there was a movie in which there was some type of alien force, there was a time when it was okay for them to be Germans or Japanese, right? Or Chinese. There was a time when, a couple decades in America, when anytime the invaders were Chinese, it was okay. And the last couple ones have been North Korean. Because I think they're the last people on earth we feel comfortable with vilifying without creating a human portrait, and I hope that disappears. The movie, The Interview, I didn't watch it for a long time, and then I did watch it. I wish I'd watched it with my teenage son, because he probably would have cracked up at all the fart jokes. Here's the thing is that North Korea is funny, right? And the Philippines is funny. And you could lampoon America. Like you could make this movie or a satire about any culture. We all have our hypocrisies and our ridiculous things. And so I'm not against that lampooning necessarily. It's just that there are so few portraits of North Korea that when they're just these, and when the average person only fields a few things about North Korea, I don't know, it encourages this. There's a defector named Park Sang-hak. He's a really wonderful guy. And along with Kang Chol-won, their life mission is to get information into North Korea. One of the things they get into North Korea is South Korean Wikipedia on thumb drives and on disks. Imagine being in North Korea where every piece of information, true or false, only comes from the state. But then you get South Korean Wikipedia, which is made and edited by the people. And when you look at an entry, you can see every single human being and every edit that they make, and that they're real people, and that they discuss on the talk pages this information, right? Think how powerful that is. A couple defectors have thought, these people need to see Kim Jong-un in a ridiculous light, and they've been smuggling that movie, The Interview, into North Korea, and by the thousands. And so it may have that copy of like, or a possibility of like dethroning in some people's minds the sovereignty of Kim Jong-un. But I would like to think that since there are actually a lot of good documentaries from the world, from Japan, from China, from Europe, from all these places, by people who care about the North, like maybe that would be the first movie they saw that we made about them. You know, that would be my wish, perhaps. But you know, that's their decision, I suppose.
Adam, for the aspiring writers in the audience, if you could give them one piece of advice, what advice would you give them?
Well, I'm a believer in labor, and I was talking to someone this morning, and they were like, you know, how much do you rewrite? And I said, well, this book, The Orphan Master's Son, I said, well, every day when I would sit down to get into it, I would rewrite the opening. And I said, so I rewrote that, you know, 1,500 times, probably. And I would just change the words, get the language right. As I knew more, it was the introduction. It had to be organic to the whole piece. It had to be perfect. And they were like, you rewrote those pages a couple times? I said, oh no, I threw those pages away. It was an old opening. But the power and joy and satisfaction of taking human experience, even if imagined, the abstraction of life lived, and converting it into the specificity of language, finding language for what it is to feel and to be alive and to be temporal and to be in the sensually ravishing world. I mean, ravishing world. I mean, that is like, to me, to not only capture that, but to transform it is like the most satisfying thing. And so it is a noble endeavor to engage in narrative. Narrative is made of what we're made of: voice and time and feeling and geography and perspective, right? And I think the work that takes is worth it. And I encourage people to go home tonight and start your novel. If you don't want to write a novel, it's your memoir.
Okay, as
Homework.
we bring
Come on, a little homework. You're not too old for homework.
as we bring the program to a close, Adam, would you have any kind of message you'd like to give our audience this afternoon?
A message, huh? Can you give me a topic? Like love or
Just
animal husbandry?
just for the people who have joined us this afternoon to listen to.
Well, I will say that seeing this many people in a room at a writers' festival warms my heart. I mean, there are two traps to being a human, and I think literature plays against both of them. One is that we're stuck in time. The future's absolutely unknown, and the past is known but forever inaccessible. That's a cruel trap, isn't it? That you know the past but can never return to things. And so we're stuck in the endless present. It's like a waterfall you swim in, right? You know? But a book can transcend that trap. And the other thing, the other trap of existence, is that you will never know the mind of another. And true, there are lovers in the audience, right? And you love that person and she loves you, but you don't know what they're thinking. And you will never know. And so it's about faith and trust. And our biggest moments in life are about testifying to what's inside of our minds. But a novel is designed specifically to transcend that and to enter the perspectives of another. And I think to engage in literature in this way is to leave yourself in the most essential way and have the ability to go encounter people of all times and places. And it's the most human act. So thank you for caring about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Johnson.
That was beautiful.